and I'm waiting to be able to see the stream. So let me know.
Good evening and welcome to The Prestige, a Vampire Rivals podcast. I am your host, EC Bond, and I'm joined tonight my co-host, my partner in crime. This is our show together. I want to make that very clear. Rav, yes, say hey.
Hey, how's it going?
So we decided that it would be a good idea to do a podcast about Vampire Rivals, which is a game that I met Rav Yes playing. He's become a very good friend of mine, and this game has captured both of our attention uh, and intrigue, for lack of a better word. So we wanted to start. We wanted to start a podcast where we can talk about the game itself, what we think about it, and everything surrounding it. So, first off, let me just give you a little intro into myself. EC Bond, how I got into this. I am a big fan of the old school World of Darkness. I think I played my first RPG of Vampire when I was 17 and have been hooked ever since. I've bought every book I can possibly find out there and consumed all this meta and really have had a good time doing it. I also played V-Test, which was Vampire the Eternal Struggle, the predecessor to Vampire Rivals. Ravias, how did you get into this game?
So I've been playing card games for it seems like forever since I was a young one in middle school. I played Magic when it first came out. I want to say in like '94. Tells you how old I am. I've been, I'm playing that on and off. I would say I'm not like a devotee, but that's kind of how I got started. And then in '97 I played Legend of the Five Rings for the first time,
Mm,
and that's when the CCG thing kind of took off.
mhm.
I remember not earlier than that, but I didn't get to play till later. What used to be called Jihad, and then eventually became Vampire: The Eternal Struggle, the card
Yeah,
game.
yeah.
So I remember that card game. I played it a little, um, and a number of other card games, and then I kind of fell out of the hobby, and then fell back into the hobby. Once I got some money, and adult life, and then I got into LCGs, competitive LCGs, starting with Netrunner. That kind of took off everywhere. I'm sure there's a lot of other Netrunner players out there. Um, and then I got back into Legend of the Five Rings when they did the new version from Fantasy Flight, um,
Right.
and that was great. I liked that a lot. And then when that dissipated, I was left wanting for a new game. I played a little bit of Keyforge, and then I ended
Mm.
up here at with Rivals right after their Kickstarter and right after the pandemic kind of slowed down. I don't think it was over yet, but people were starting to come out of their caves.
Yeah, that's a good point to mention is that this game, for me, I guess for a lot of us, kind of picked up as soon as the pandemic was waning. And I that's when I know I met Rav. Yes, I met a couple other players at Geeky Teas in Burbank, California, which we should give them a shout out because that's a great shop. It's been very supportive of this game and other games. Again, that's Geeky Teas in Burbank. Um, but it's funny that a game about vampires was the one to bring us out of the pandemic shell that we were all in.
Yeah.
Ravias and I are also very avid board gamers, and we do enjoy playing those. I probably played, I don't know how many freaking board games I've owned in my life, but again, money came into play, and when you have a lot of money and you have an adult life, you can afford to buy the toys that you want to play with.
Right. Yeah. Same here. I think, I started. It's funny. I started as a card game player, pretty exclusively, things like Magic and stuff like that. But then, I got into video games, and then I got into board games. So
Mm,
I have a huge collection. I like it a lot. I like games like Twilight Imperium, heavy strategy games,
mm.
but I also like small games too. Things like Coup and stuff like that are really popular right now. And so yeah, I think I'm all in for the big revolution of board game design, and I think this is a great example of that. Rivals is a great design, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a great intro to Vampire Rivals as a competitive card game. I'd argue, some board game elements in the form of a city deck, which we'll get a little bit more into later on. But as far as Rivals, Ravias, what do you think of this game and compare it to other competitive card games?
Yeah, I think the first thing that should stand out to competitive card game players is the 4-player format. Now, it's not always 4 players. You can play it at 2, and you can play it at 3. But in my opinion, it seems to shine at 4 players.
Yes,
I think it and it feels like it was designed for 4 players,
I agree. Yeah,
with 4 players in mind. And the other thing that's unique about it is the city deck, which is a common deck that is affecting all players in an interval, 1 card a turn, and is randomized. So you don't know how it's going to affect you. You know what's in the deck, and you know the number of cards of a particular type, but you don't know when those are going to come out. And actually, there's an even further randomization of the events. We'll get into that later. But yes,
sure. Well,
very interesting.
yeah, let's get into it now since we're talking about it, what the
Sure.
city deck is. So, to back up a little bit, any competitive card game worth its salt is generally considered that you have a library of cards at your disposal. Uh, Magic is one of those CCG games where you buy boosters or you buy a box, you buy all these cards, and then you build from the cards that you've purchased. Vampire Rivals is more of an LCG model in the sense where you buy all the cards up front. So every player that's playing this game, it has access to every card. We all have the same cards to pull from. So there is no, I don't know how you describe it. There is no way to, you're buying one card that can absolutely demolish every other deck because you're the only one who has it. That doesn't exist in Rivals.
Yeah, actually, there's a very heavy attention to balance,
Hmm.
even more so because you don't have constantly changing meta. In a game like Magic, you can always release cards to adjust the meta. You can drop old cards out to adjust the meta, to adjust the balance, I should say. But in an LCG or in a model like this, you have to be extra careful because everybody's going to have these cards and they're going to have access to them for a really long time. And
Hmm.
there's far fewer of the cards in the pool. So those are
Hmm.
some things that change it a little bit.
So, as far as the structure of a Vampire Rivals game, one thing I wanted to bring up, I think we both kind of agree on this, is that if you're learning this game for the first time, the rulebook is not great.
Yeah.
It's not the greatest rulebook to teach a card game. I would suggest if you want to learn, get a few people together that can all kind of work through the rulebook together. Because if you just sit down and you read it, there's just a little bit that gets lost, right? It's a little dense. It's a little difficult to really understand. Um, but hopefully, you have someone in the area who knows how to play already, and they can kind of walk you through it. Um, that being said, once you get to the top of the mountain, everything makes sense. It's a very fluid game once you start playing it, um, and it's very competitive as well. The idea is that not everyone, like, it's hard to say who's going to win a game from the onset. Um, the way you play the game, the way you interact with that city deck does matter and affect each game, which for me is part of the fun, and it's what keeps me coming back to it.
Yeah, and in that way, it borrows, I think, heavily from more of the board game culture, which is a little less overly competitive. It's a little less like hyper analytical.
Uh huh.
It's a it's
Yeah.
a little bit more just experiencing it, just having fun. Random stuff
Yeah.
happens, weird things happen. You can't predict it. I think there's a lot of that injected into this game, and actually, it's sort of missing from competitive card games having that sort of randomized element. So, anyways, yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's interesting.
So the way you play this game, the way you win this game, there's essentially three ways. You can knock out all of your rivals' vampires. Now, if you're playing a four-player game, you would have only one rival that you're basically assigned, and if you take out all of that rival's vampires, you win. Another way to do it is, again, with that one rival, if you drain all their prestige, which is essentially their life. Now, Ravias and I were kind of talking about this before the stream started. We're not quite sure who you are as a player in this meta, in this world, right? And Vitas, Vampire the Eternal Struggle, it was clear that you were an ancient vampire referred to as a Methuselah, which anyone who's a fan of the World of Darkness would refer to before the Flood. Um, so, a very old, very powerful vampire, and you're using your blood pool to influence and control essentially younger vampires, right? Rob, is that kind of what we're thinking about with Rivals? It's kind of the same
Yeah,
structure, right?
yeah. So I'd say, you can call yourself what you want. If it makes sense, call yourself a Methuselah because it kind of fits. You're leading a group of vampires,
Right.
and who is called a coterie, um, and you're helping them win. And I guess, basically that's it. But yeah, you could say Methuselah, you can say whatever. It's not really spelled out in the rules, but um,
Right.
it kind of doesn't matter that much.
It doesn't really matter. It's more like if you wanted to tell the story in your brain, what you're doing, you're an older vampire. Now, each player has a library of cards, a minimum of 40, a faction deck, which is where your vampires are. Then you have a haven and an agenda card. Now, your haven is essentially like your home base, and that haven card will give you certain benefits. Your agenda card is how you gain agenda points, which are victory points, and if you get to 13, you win the game automatically. The other part of the game, once you're all set up, is the city deck, which we've kind of touched on already. But each round, a new city deck card, not each round, I should say, each player's turn, the first thing you do is draw from the city deck. And it could be a human, like a tour guide or a cap. And when you can attack these humans, you can interact with these humans. Or it can be an event that will limit ranged combat, right? Or it could every leader has to go out to the street, excuse me, and is now unprotected in a sense.
Yeah. For those who are interested in sort of the deeper aspects, when it comes to the events, there are 10, and you will only be in any given game playing with 6 of them. Is that
Mm.
right?
I
Uh,
believe so. You take all 10 event cards in the beginning of the game, and I believe you remove 4. So that would put yeah,
right.
yeah.
Which is a further randomization and is a further illustration of this game is different every single time you play.
Right. So that's a basic, very basic outline of the game. But it's not quite what we wanted to do with this podcast. We wanted to get into the real nitty gritty, the strategy of it, and talk about some of the things we like. So we're going to start with this podcast with deck types. Now, every player comes to the table with a deck they've built. You can use a pre-constructed deck, which we should touch on before we go any further. I would like to hear about this from you, Rav, yes, because in my experience with starter decks, they're not very good most games. But in Rivals, the starter decks that they actually give you are pretty good.
Yeah, I think these are good, especially if you're learning the game, to see a lot of the different types of strategies that you'll be able to use. Um, a special call out to the Bruja one. If we get into the clans, we can explain what Bruja is. But suffice to say, that's one of the factions is Bruja. The Bruja pre-made is really good right out of the box. If you want a recommendation of the first deck to play to sort of see the most basic way to play the game, the Bruja one's really good.
I agree.
Some of the harder ones are the conspiracy one. That's the Malkavian one, but still valuable to play because you'll start to see some of the more complicated cards, how they work, how they interact, and then the other decks that you pick up either in the base set or in the expansions all do a very good job of sort of explaining or making you play through some of the different types of cards that you'll see in the base set and the expansions.
And we should note that if you're a fan of the World of Darkness and Vampire the Masquerade, you are going to absolutely love the way the clans are represented. So real quick we should go into just the core set, the clans that you will get from the onset. Those would be Toreador, also known as posers or artists. Um, their clan weakness, which this is just flavor, because I'm a nerd when it comes to this stuff, but it's not really key to the vampire rivals. But anyways, Toreador, they have a weakness where they become enthralled by art or anything beautiful. You have the Bruja, which Ravies had mentioned. They are known as the rebels, and they're very. They tend to frenzy or lose control and become very aggressive and let the beast take over. A very violent clan in a lot of ways. The other clan in the core set is the Ventru, referred to as the Blue Bloods or the Aristocrats. In the game, each Ventru vampire has a curse in which they can only feed off of a certain type of human, whether it be a politician or someone, a homeless person. Like it would be a very, very specific designation that each vampire has individually. So you could only feed from those people. That might be a little too much. But and then the other clan I'm going blank on that's in the core set.
Malkavian.
That's right. And why do I
Of
forget about the
course,
Malkavian?
yes. Obfuscate.
Obfuscate. Yeah, they kind of
Yeah.
like they disappear from sight. They're also known. They're called the lunatics. Um, I think it's the old joke with the Malkavian is when they get embraced and turn into a vampire, they're told the true meaning of life and they go crazy with the knowledge. Really cool stuff. Those are the four clans in the core set. Now, there have been three expansions, correct me? Three?
That is right, as of right now.
As of
Three
right now.
expansions.
Three expansions that have introduced more clans to the world. The first expansion was Thin Bloods and Tremere, the hated Tremere. The next expansion was the Nosferatu and Gangrel. And then the third expansion, which just came out very recently, actually, as of this podcast, it's going to be tournament ready in about a week. So you can start using the new set, which is La Sombra and Hecta. And wait, am I saying that right?
Hard to know. It could be Hecata, could be Hecata.
Hecata, I think is probably a better way of saying it.
I'm sure on this podcast later we'll talk about some of the different clans and how hard it is to pronounce their names. But we'll go with Hecata. Is that what you said? We'll go with that.
No, Hecata I do like. Hecata sounds a little bit better. If we're not getting an official ruling on how to pronounce words, Hecata is the way we go. And for those who are want to know a little bit more, that is like a merging of the Giovanni, the I don't know who the Cappadocians, all these different clan of undead that like to deal with ghosts and spirits and stuff like that.
Yeah,
So,
small aside on that. Just giving people background on what's happening and why we even have a card game right now. The World of Darkness IP has been kicked around a couple times to different companies. Right now, Renegade, the company that makes this game, is giving it a treatment on both the RPG and on the card game. The RPG is now on V5. The card game is based off of the V5 lore. So if you're confused, if you're a previous player and you don't know what the heck's going on, check out the V5 stuff and it'll start to make more sense.
yeah, absolutely. If you're a fan of the World of Darkness old school, you're not going to be disappointed by the new V5 stuff. It's pretty cool. I like the way they brought everything back and made it a game again. And the short and sweet of it is that vampires no longer just rule the world arbitrarily. Like they have to worry about humans. They have to worry about other things that are hunting them down. So it's a little bit balanced, and I like that about it. Cool. So that being said, the nitty gritty of Vampire Rivals. There are agenda cards and there are haven cards, and that's commonly how most players will refer to their deck, is what is their agenda or what is the haven that they are running. Um, and it's a good, quick way to just kind of give everyone an idea of what it is. Now, in a tournament, you don't necessarily have to announce what your agenda is when you sit down to play. That gets revealed as you play. Um, but after a while, everyone kind of knows what you're doing based on your haven, which is always visible for everyone to see. So let's start with one of my favorite havens. It's actually the haven that got me a tournament win for the first time. Thank you. It's called Dragon's Roost. And Ravios, I was hoping you'd search and put up Dragon's Roost on the screen so we can see
Yeah,
it
I'm working on it.
there.
It's a little bit. We're still working out some of the kinks. What is it? Okay, that's Also, quick note to EC.
Mhm.
Seems like the stream is my stream live.
This,
I'm not seeing. I'm not seeing my changes come up.
yeah, it's saying there is a delay, but I'm not seeing the changes either.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
it should be up. Dragon's Roost is up. Well, we can just start talking, and hopefully it'll come up and let me know if
Well,
we need to choose.
since we're testing, so then I'm
Yep.
looking at the screen, the Skype screen, and it's not up there. So I don't know, maybe you pulled it up in a different browser?
Let me stop sharing. Let's try this again. Share screen.
That's me. Take that
Share
off.
screen.
Who wants to see that?
And
Thank you. That's up. That works.
okay, we're doing better. Now, I still don't see it on stream, but I'll let you figure that out, EC. So,
Well, in about 30 seconds, you're about to see my blubbery ass on your screen. So get ready
that's
for
okay.
that, lovely image. COVID
Yep.
has done its toll to everyone,
There-
and it's definitely
there
done
you
its
are.
toll to me. Yeah, how do I look, huh?
You're a beautiful man.
Thank you. I'm a lot of
Yeah.
me there. I didn't.
Okay. So Dragon's Roost is, we're talking about this card. We're talking about tournament decks now, right? Is that where we're at?
Yes, correct.
So we're talking about this card because it is huge in the meta. It's had its ups and downs. It's been in the meta since it got printed. I think it got printed in the original set, right?
Correct. It's a core card.
I think I think it was what is waiting on was strength in numbers, which I think was in the first expansion pack.
I believe so. That was a Tremere card. Thin Blood. It was a Thin Blood card. Yeah.
It's a Thin Blood themed card. It's not an actual. It's not like in the Thin Bloods, but it's themed around the kind of like play style
Right.
that they do. But what people figured out was it works well with Dragon's Roost, and the reason why it works well with Dragon's Roost is that the deck type likes to play a lot of small vampires, relatively small vampires. It likes to run as its leader vampires like Bad Penny. Let me see if I can pull Bad Penny up.
While you're doing that, let's go ahead and explain that combo. So we're looking at strength in numbers with Dragon's Roost. Now, the idea behind Dragon's Roost, it's an agenda card, and it states that at the start of your turn, if you control 3 characters in the street, you gain 1 agenda. If you control 4+ characters with a BP of 2+ in the street, gain 2 agenda. Now, again, this is at the beginning of your turn in which you would gain agenda if you meet these criteria.
Yeah, so that's the agenda. And it's important, I think, to mention that right now, I would say if you're building a deck that's going to win on agenda, you want to at least be getting 2 a turn, or the possibility of getting 2 a turn, if not more like 3 or 4. Your deck is being very fast if it gets to 4 a turn, extremely fast, and I don't think any deck can consistently get 4 a turn. You're looking at between 3 and 4 at a very fast deck. So that agenda giving you 2 a turn without doing anything active is great, because then you can use both your actions for more points. So that's the basic idea of that agenda. Now, why that works with Dragon's Roost is typically you're running a relatively small starting leader vampire. So I have up on screen Bad Penny. She works very well in this deck because what Dragon's Roost does is Dragon's Roost you can basically jump out in front. Let me pull up Dragon's Roost as I talk about it. Dragon's Roost is a haven where if you run it, you are allowed to block any attack in the streets as it's happening. So what that means is normally when you do an attack and on somebody in particular, they can block with their vampires, but that's it. Nobody else can block. If you attack something in the streets like one of the citizens or a SAD, nobody can block that, right? Typically. What Dragon's Roost does is it allows you to use your leader to block any attack in the streets. That means any attack on a vampire in the streets, any attack on a citizen in the streets. that is a disruption strategy, right? So normally you don't get to be able to attack things in the streets, and now you actually have to, a lot of times, just ask the Dragon's Roost player, are you going to block me when I do this thing? And of course, they don't have to tell you one way or the other, but it gives you a certain level of control over the board. You can stop somebody from getting a point in the street, and that's huge. If they're running away with it, you can say, okay, you're going too fast. I'm going to slow you down.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to throw my leader in front of your attack. Now, the downside is you're going to take that attack. So you got to have something that's ready to take that attack.
Yeah, I like playing Dragon's Roost because I was running a card. Let me see if I can pull it up for you guys. But I was running Jesus, or Jesus,
Jesus.
as I like to call him, just
Yeah.
because what he does is, oh, thank you. If he gets killed, then you're allowed to gain an agenda, right? Which is very, very powerful.
Right.
So I was using Dragon's Roost with Jesus as my leader, sending Jesus out there to block someone's action, and then letting him die and gaining the
Yeah.
agenda.
Yeah.
And I felt like the threat of that action, the threat of Dragon's Roost, was enough in a game to get me the win because people had to deal with me on a certain level.
Yeah. So painting the picture for y'all, and in general, every deck strategy revolves around 3 cards first. What is your agenda? What is your haven? And what is your leader? So in this particular case, with Dragon's Roost, you're going to have probably strength in numbers, Dragon's Roost, and then some leader. And the reason why that leader is going to be, so most decks run a 6 or a 5 as their leader because you want your leader to be hardy. You want it to be able to survive a lot of attacks because you're going to get hit a lot. And you want your leader to be doing most of your point gaining actions. If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why you run a smaller vampire in this scenario is you need to, can you bring up the strength in numbers?
Sure, yeah.
So with strength in numbers, you want to have at least 3 vampires in the street at any given time. If you have 4 vampires in the street, let me see the text of the card so I don't mess this up.
It's 4 vampires with 2 BP in the streets. If that's what
there you go.
Get to.
Yeah. So the thing is, because you have a prestige limit and because you're spending prestige in all these vampires you're bringing out, it is difficult to be running 4 vampires with some of them being above 4. Can you bring up 5 BP or strength in numbers? BP.
Sure. Say again.
So it's hard to run 6s and 5s when you have 4 vampires out. You start to go too low in prestige. And prestige is a great way to die, right? If your prestige goes to 0, you're dead. If you bring out a bunch of vampires that are expensive, you're very close to death, right? So with strengths and numbers, the design is you go wide and not tall, right? There are a lot of small vampires. That's the design. So your leader you're going to want it to be something that can die, right?
So
you have a lot of small,
right?
Exactly, because it's going to get hit a lot, right? So typically that's why you see something like Jesus, or you see something like Bad Penny. Jesus is good because, as you can see here, you'll get a point typically every single time he dies. And because of the way that Dragon's Roost gives you a prestige every time you do that block. You're going to have the prestige to spend. As you can see on Jesus, you spend 1 prestige for that point when it dies. You can basically cycle that prestige. You don't actually have to spend any extra prestige on that. Now, you're losing 1 because Jesus is going into torpor. FYI to the new players, torpor is where vampires go when they die.
Mm-hmm.
They don't die for good. That's one of the interesting things about this game. It's been in other vampire games as well. But basically, a vampire will go into torpor. It'll have to heal back up. And then when it gets back up to blood, it'll come back to your coterie and be active. But when it goes into torpor, you're going to lose 1 prestige because you're going to have to mend it once for intentionally. So in a deck like this, you're always worried about prestige getting too low. So the natural extra 1 you get every single time you block with Dragon's Roost is going to keep that, cycle happening for you and not putting you in danger territory. Let me bring up Bad Penny so you all can see that as well. So Bad Penny is a little bit more of the normal leader of this deck. Bad Penny, the reason why she sees a lot of play as the leader of this deck is because she comes out of torpor super fast. So her ability reads torpor at the end of your turn, add 1 blood from the general supply to this character if in torpor. Naturally, you automatically get a blood, and you can drop a card for an extra blood. So to our new players, in torpor, every turn you can discard a card to mend any vampire once per vampire. That goes for torpor as well. So a great way to get a vampire out of torpor is to mend it with those extra cards. It also gets a free one. So Bad Penny, being a 4, usually would mean 2 turns. 2 turns, she comes back. But because she mends so quickly in torpor, she comes back in 1 turn. So that's why she works in this deck. She's a 4 BP vampire. She's small. She comes back quickly when she gets knocked out. And on top of all that, and we'll get into this a little bit later, I don't want to bore y'all, but she has 2 obfuscate. And there's a lot of cards that like that. Also, she's Malkavian. And right now, there's a lot of great Malkavian cards. I'll give you 1 good Malkavian card to look at, and that is Insanity Defense. It is currently the best defense card in the game. It gives you 2 defense on every attack type except for range. We won't get into that right now. We'll get into it eventually. But that's 3 out of 4 attack types it can block. And for mental, it blocks 3. It's really hard to beat it. It's maybe the best defense in the game, and it's locked into Malkavian. So having a Malkavian is just a naturally good thing to have. Jesus also gets that. He is a Malkavian. He also gives you access to Insanity Defense. Thoughts on that, EC?
I couldn't agree more. When you're thinking of Dragon's Roost and you're thinking of Bad Penny, thinking of Malkavians, Insanity Defense is an absolute must-have, bar none. Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, go ahead.
The other strategy for this deck is you have 3 other vampires, and those are your vampires that are going to go into the streets and get points. They're going to hit other vampires and get points. And Bad Penny is there to disrupt other decks. Mm-hmm. Bad Penny does not go get her points herself. So it's very important to keep her untapped. Sorry, not untapped. That's a trademark of Wizards of the Coast.
Don't tell anyone we use that term.
No, they can't get us for just saying it. But I just don't want to offend anybody. I don't know what they call it. What do they call it in this game?
Exhaust? Ready?
Exhausted. So you want to leave Bad Penny unexhausted because you want to have the option in the 3 other turns to disrupt anybody at any given time. That's the power of this deck, disruption.
Yes, absolutely.
Otherwise, you're using your 3 other vampires to hit the streets for points or hit other vampires for points.
And again,
yeah, go ahead.
And I was going to just reiterate the threat of this. Actually, put it back up. The threat of this combo is usually enough to get you where you need to be.
Yes.
Yeah.
The threat. That's a good point. So it is an oppressive deck. It is hard to play against. It's hard to play around. You have to really start getting good at table talk.
Yeah.
In order to convince this player, hey, I'm not a threat. You don't need to stop me here. Or sometimes you play. Oftentimes, what people think is that it's a tax, right? So if I go to the streets, if Dragon's Roost is not in the game, if I go to the streets, I know I'm going to kill whatever I'm going to hit, right? I'm not going to, I know how much damage it takes. I know I have to play a card or not play a card, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when Bad Penny's out there and Dragon Roost and Strength in Numbers, now you got to worry, okay, I need to play a card to attack. I have to, because what if Bad Penny blocks, right? And so oftentimes what it does is it makes you play, and you have to make that decision before the defender chooses whether they're going to block, right? So if they choose to block, you don't get to go back and play a card, right? So what that does is it basically pulls a card out of your hand. It's a tax. And that's the main thing, is that everybody now has to play a card when they go to the city because they have to threaten Bad Penny, right? They have to, at least give the Dragon's Roost player a reason not to block them, right? And that is the strength of this deck: disruption, control. It's in that control category for you other card game players.
Nice. So
Thoughts on that?
no, yeah, I think we've covered Dragon's Roost. Moving on to aggro decks, or
Aggro decks.
another term for aggression decks, or decks that like
Yep.
to go out there and punch things.
Yep.
And there are two kind of ways of thinking about aggro decks. There are aggro decks that go after your rival, and aggro decks that go after the city deck.
Yep. Yeah. So, and I would say that the most popular right now, the ones that are most effective, are the ones that know how to pivot. A lot of times when we talk about this game, we talk about pivoting. And the reason is because of the changing game state, it is really hard for you to go one direction. And that's going to be new for a lot of competitive card game players, because typically the way you design your decks is around one strategy that you just do really well, right? In this game, you want to have a main strategy, but you want to be able to pivot into something else in case something falls apart. So typically the attack decks these days are based around city-related agendas. So one of them, and one of the ones you're going to see a lot in the top decks, I want to say at least one of the princes has been Hunt the Hunters. And basically the way this works is you're going to get extra points for killing Sad. So Sad is it is a card, a mortal that comes out in the streets that will do damage every single turn to every single player. We like to think of this as a clock, right? The idea is that these come out. If they get killed, they go into a discard pile instead of a burn pile, and then they will come back into the deck if the deck empties. So what happens is you're only going to ever get more Sad towards the end of the game, right? You start with a couple, then there's 3, then there's 4. There's a total of 4 in the deck. It can never be more than 4. But once you finish out the deck, the whole deck of cards, all you're going to get at this point is Sad.
Right. And Ravias is referring to the city deck, which does have a set number. In a 4-player game, each player draws a city deck card at the beginning of their turn, so you can imagine by round 4, maybe even round 5, you're looking at a city deck that is mainly going to be Sad, Special Affairs Division mortals that will hit all your vampires with aggravated damage, which can burn them outright. And another thing to note about Sad, and they're also referred to as antagonists, is that they can hit you in your haven. You can't hide from them.
Right. There's such a thing as secrecy and intel. We won't get into that right now, but it matters in terms of Sad. But we'll kind of save that for a little bit.
Right. So right now, what I have up is that when we're talking about aggro decks, Hunt the Hunters, which is Rob's card. So we're testing. So let's talk this out, Rob, because I'm thinking of a different format for just how this is going to look.
Sure.
You're probably looking at it now on the stream, so you can kind of get an idea.
Yep.
But it's basically I pull up a card, you pull up a card, and then and we go from there.
Yeah. We already figured it out. We just gotta make it look a little prettier, but
yeah, it's gotta look pretty, but it's there.
Yeah.
So Hunt the Hunters, take it away.
Yeah. So So it's good to bring up Turf War, because I want to say that when you start playing this game, Turf War is a good starting place for aggressive decks. If you look at the agenda, you can tell it's built for aggressive decks. It gives you an extra point. So normally when you're playing an aggressive deck, what you're trying to do is kill your rival, rival. So when you start the game, you get a number. That's your rival. That's the person you're trying to kill. If you kill them, you win. In the case of the Turf War agenda, you can also get points for killing a non-rival, which is not normal. You also get points for killing any vampire that's 5 BP or more. That's whether it's your rival, your whoever, it doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
So it pushes you towards killing vampires, right? That's kind of obvious. One thing that's changed in the meta is that because of the pivot, because you do sometimes have to pivot, I think not completely. Turf War is still playable, but I don't see it as often as I used to. And what I typically see now for attack decks is attack decks that can attack the city, because the city, there's a lot of points there, right? You get points for sad, you get points for mortals, you sometimes get points for vagrants. So
yes.
now taking a look at Hunt the Hunters. Hunt the Hunters gives you another reason to go after sad, right? It gives you an extra point for sad, right? So that's 2 points every time you kill a sad, or the first time you kill a sad, I should say. And you get a prestige. Prestige is great in this game. It's a buffer, right? If you're adding a prestige, that means nobody's going to kill you on prestige drain. We'll get into prestige drain in a little bit, but just, you don't want to be prestige drain, and this helps keep you from doing that. So 2 points every time you hit a sad. Here's another thing about Hunt the Hunters. When you kill the sad, you immediately shuffle that sad and anything else in the discard pile back into the city deck. That keeps the city deck from emptying and causes sad to come out at a different rate. I'm not going to get too far into that, but it definitely changes the way that the city deck plays. It adjusts it, and now you're in control.
So let me ask you this, Rob, because I've seen this played many ways, but I have seen this played before several times. But I still, even reading it now, have the question. So with Hunt the Hunters as my agenda, and plus this has been rewritten too.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
What if you kill a sad? If you kill a sad with Hunt the Hunters as your agenda, that sad gets shuffled back into the deck?
Yes.
Okay. But if someone else kills in on their turn and they're not using Hunt the Hunters, that sad is then burned.
No.
Okay. Then explain that to me.
It is discarded.
Okay.
So anytime anyone kills a sad, it goes into the discard pile.
Okay.
Almost every other card will go into the burn pile. The only other time you're going to see something get discarded is from a card effect that comes from your library, right? So there's a couple cards. There's a sheriff. There's a couple other ones, but suffice to say, I think there's another Haven. That's the only way that they're going to go into the discard. Other than it's a sad, right? A sad always goes into the discard when you kill it.
That's what I wasn't sure of, but okay. So that's one aggro deck. We're looking at Hunt the Hunters. Another one is going to be Invisible Army. When a character in your coterie attaches a Vagrant as a retainer, and a Vagrant comes from the city deck, they gain 2 agenda. When you defeat a character with an attached Vagrant, gain 1 agenda. So what you're basically doing is going after Vagrants in a city deck, but also going after other vampires who have attached Vagrants, because they are your Vagrants, and you will get points for killing that guy.
Yeah. So so the nice thing about this is that there are 5 Vagrants in the deck. And another thing about Invisible Army to notice is, and actually it's nice to have, well, I pulled up Flint, but Hunt the Hunters will only give you 2 points once a turn when you hit a sad. If you hit a second sad, you're only going to get 1 point for that.
Right.
Invisible Army will give you 2 points for Vagrants every time you get a Vagrant.
Yeah.
So that gives you a chance for, in a single turn, to get 4 points, which is nice. Having that burst.
Yeah, it is nice. I wanted to just jump in because it's not easy to do. Like, Vagrants are not commonly left in the city deck even before Invisible Army came out, because they're very valuable. Yeah.
Correct. The reason why I pulled up General Flint is because the reason why people go Invisible Army is usually because they're trying to go General Flint. There's a nice like synergy there. General Flint says on his box, if this character has 1+ retainers, the target has -1 shield. If the character has 2+ retainers, this attack also does 1+1 damage. In attack decks, you want to squeeze out damage wherever you can find it. And that is why General Flint is heavily played these days, because getting that extra damage is great. It synergizes because Vagrants are the easiest thing to pick up. because they only cost 2 blood to kill, you don't have to spend a card to grab them. The other nice thing on that box is that I think EC, you already mentioned this. If you hit a character and kill that character and they have a Vagrant on them, you're also going to get a point. So it lends itself to an aggressive deck style where you're going to be able to kill other vampires. I will say, once a Vagrant is on a vampire, it is hard to kill them because Vagrants are great at defending. Vagrants will give you a free defense of any type. They are the best defense in the game, depending on who you ask. But I think that they're the best defense in the game. They're the most universal defense in the game.
Certainly the most universal. Whether or not they're the best, I think, is still. I mean, they're the only mortal that gives you defense. So that's the other side of that, right? Like they're the only mortal that really gives you any defense.
And it's great design because they're the only mortal that doesn't give you a point, and people still want them. That tells you something.
Yeah, exactly.
So Vagrants, easy to kill, easy to grab, easy to attach. Hard to kill off of somebody else's vampire because they give natural defense.
Yeah.
But that's the deck style. General Flint typically, Invisible Army typically, and then you'll also see typically a Haven that helps you there too. So let's say the Shelter. So I'm going to pull that up. There you go. And what this Haven does, and it'll slowly come up on the stream, is gives characters in your coterie with 1+ Vagrants attached have +1 secrecy in the streets. Okay, now it's time to talk about secrecy. So when a vampire typically attacks somebody in your Haven, all your vampires have a natural +1 secrecy in your Haven, right? Which is one of 2 zones in the game. You have your Haven and your streets. All the good stuff happens in the streets. When you're attacking vampires, when you're attacking city mortals, when you're attacking SAD, all that happens in the streets. Haven is where you go to not get hit, right? It's your home base, right?
Right.
It's in the lore of the game, nobody's supposed to know where your Haven is, right? Because you don't want to get killed. You don't want somebody to come when you're sleeping and stake you, right? So the Haven has what's called in this game secrecy. Secrecy forces a vampire that's attacking you to discard a card from their hand in order to complete that attack for every secrecy they have. So that's naturally 1 in your Haven. Naturally, you have 1 secrecy in your Haven. In the streets, you naturally have 0 secrecy, except in this case, in the Shelter, you have +1 if you have a Vagrant. So this fits into that same thing. You have General Flynn. You're going for Vagrants. You're attaching Vagrants. They're giving you secrecy, and they're giving you points. That's the idea. Typically, it's an attack deck.
There you
now,
go.
Going back to Hunt the Hunters, just to go through a couple things about the Hunters, let me bring up one vampire people like to run, Trinity. I'll be quick about this. Trinity, when it comes up on screen, is a Gangrel vampire. Attackers in her party do +2 damage to antagonists. So what that means is a lot of times she's going to one-shot a SAT. And that's why it works in Hunt the Hunters. I think that's self-explanatory.
I agree. All right. We are almost at 50 minutes, so let's end this. This was a test. If you're watching this, thank you very much. But there'll be better.